This is the European edition of Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. We bring you the European unicorns, startups, founders, regulators, and leaders innovating the rapidly evolving fintech scene today. A truly localized podcast with both English and local language content, with some of the world's most well-known hosts and influencers in the fintech sector globally. Join us every week as we explore what makes the European Union a phenomenal proving ground for many of the fastest growing fintech plays in the world today. Okay, let's roll.
Welcome back to Breaking Banks Europe. My name is Nina Mohanty, and I am one of the co-hosts of the Breaking Banks Europe gang, if you will. Today, on episode 116, we're talking about breaking carbon and green credit. I'm very excited for this because this is an area of finance that I have never really understood. And I've seen a lot of fintech companies that have come to the forefront to tackle various green challenges, with the ultimate challenge, of course, being climate change, that existential doom that keeps me up at night. And I think many of us along with that. But I am here joined today by two far more intelligent and knowledgeable folks on the topic. The first is Mathias Wikström, who is the CEO of Doconomy. Mathias, how are you doing?
Pretty good, Nina. Thank you very much.
I'm glad to hear that. And we also are joined by Iwa Pawlak, who's the CEO and founder of Smart Forest. How are you, Iwa?
I'm also fine. Thanks
so
for
much
the invitation.
Thank you for joining us. So to start off, I would really love to discuss your own businesses. I think off the back of, the recent news, COP26 last year in November, there's so much money being poured into green finance as a whole. And this is, at every level and every part of the financial ecosystem. But we see it all the time on my Instagram now. I get targeted sponsored content from various fintech companies telling me to get a wooden card or, use this proposition that is green. And I think as well, with particularly the millennial and Gen Z generation, there is definitely a huge desire, or dare I say even imperative, to take climate change very seriously. And that, of course, affects every part of our life, not just in maybe what we choose to eat, how we shop, but also down to our finances. So, Mathias, I'll let you go first. Can you tell us a bit more about you and Doconomy?
Sure. Thank you very much. Mathias Wikström, co-founder and CEO of Doconomy, working out of Stockholm. We've gone from 17 to 75 in about a year and a half. So rapidly expanding, building on our capabilities, pretty much also reflecting your observations, Nina, around the interest for the topic and also the urgent need for the solutions. So Doconomy was set up about 3 years ago, calculating the environmental impact transaction for transaction. Making your credit card or payment card or your consumption sort of an educational instrument of its own instead of just a means for purchases. We also, that's one of our services, calculating every transaction, making it count in CO2 emissions equivalent, but also in water. The second one is calculating on product level, making every SKU or line item data carry a environmental impact as well as financial cost with a 2030 calculator. And the third one is the lifestyle calculator that sort of sets the ground for the understanding of all of impact that we developed together with the United Nations leading up to COP26 that you noted earlier. Basically giving everyone in the world a chance to understand their impact and how to reduce it. So that's pretty much me and Doconomy.
Brilliant. And listeners, you may have heard of Doconomy before if you've ever used a Klarna card, for example, or even MasterCard, where there was a recent partnership that was announced. So that's probably where you've heard that before. Iwa, I'm going to throw it over to you. Can you tell us a bit about Smart Forest and what led you to founding it?
Yes, sure. We are basically slightly from the other side than Matthias. So we allow to invest in real trees, in real forests. So how it works, someone could go to the bank, for example, and put the money on deposit, or they would have a chance to buy a real living tree. And when the tree will be at the end of the harvesting cycle, cut it, then the person could get the timber or the money out of it. Obviously, there is a little bit IT in that involved. So we basically create the NFT certificate for every tree. So the owner would somehow interact with the tree and see, for example, the weather conditions, because there are also the IoT sensors on the plantation. We also try to measure how much CO2 the trees is neutralizing. And basically for that, we have the carbon credit counter. So the owner would know how much his tree, for example, neutralize offset CO2 per week, let's say.
That's so brilliant. And I love that it kind of mixes the Web 2, Web 3 world, and in fact, even the real world with actual living trees. Really gives a whole new meaning to the word tree hugger. I really love what both of you are building there. Pardon my pun. And this is something that I think, a lot of us often feel that it's such an overwhelming problem, right? There's so much to do. And how does one person change the world? I take my tote bag and I reuse my tote bag and I don't use plastic straws and I recycle. And I keep thinking, am I moving the needle at all? And so it's really great that, there are products actually being built where consumers can come together and make really magnified change here, I think. I wanted to kind of flip the script now. So we're talking about, your businesses and carbon credit. I think a lot of times, a lot of people that think of green fintech often think of like investments. I think of like Climate, for example, or there's a lot of new different businesses cropping up that very much focus on where you invest. So are you kind of divesting from fossil fuels and all those types of things? But I think what is also equally interesting is the topic, of course, of carbon credit. So maybe to start, Mathias, I'll ask you, what exactly are carbon credits? What is green credit?
Oh, that's a very good question, and it also defines one of the challenges in this space, because carbon credits today can mean so many different things, and there is just recently regulations or advice on how to use what words in what context. So impact, for example, or impact investing. What is the difference in impact investing and sustainability investing compared to ESG investing? So the carbon credits could be in one component, and it can be in corresponding with the initial ambitions in the Kyoto Protocol when it comes to carbon offsetting and establishing a trade around carbon credits on national level, so that you put limits to each and every nation's carbon emissions, and you could trade in those emissions should you exceed or subsede your desires. But I think to the retail market today, carbon credits comes down as a wording, comes more down to the traditional carbon offsetting. And coming back to your amazing remark on tree hugger, I think that nature-based solutions are the ones that people today in the retail market associate the most with it. Looking at what you can do out of a Doconomy perspective, we would like to, and to Eva's point, we're coming at this from two different ends, really, and I love what Eva and the guys are doing. We're coming from the angle where we try to educate around how to measure your impact. So measuring it, tracking and measuring your impact and making it understood, educating yourself around how much is 1 kilo of carbon emissions and how is it, what negative effect does it have and how is it rendered, kind of thing. And then at the end of the day, we of course hope to provide opportunities to reduce your impact through more conscious consumption or lifestyle changes, but there will still be CO2 emissions that you would need to potentially offset that you can't reduce really. And then that's where Eva's solution, amongst many others, kicks in. And we also now see a great lot of innovation in that space. So I would say that the most precise definition, if you're looking at carbon credits out of the carbon offsetting perspective, would be potentially direct air carbon capture, such as Climate Works or doing in Iceland, and extracting carbon, which becomes an apple for an apple kind of thing. And that's very, very precise out of that perspective, out of achieving one positive carbon kilo emissions and one reduction and 1 kilo carbon emissions rendered. But the importance of carbon offsetting in the retail perspective of carbon credits is the fact that every action has a reaction. And we have for many years now, and we see that tremendous growth in the US the most around carbon offsetting being the holy grail. I don't have to change anything as long as I pay up. I can fly wherever I need to as long as I slap another $10 on the ticket. And that we are very afraid of, because nor have you had any insight around what the impact of your behavior is. And if you don't have the insight, how can you then try to adjust it? But on a high level, I think carbon offsetting as a financial instrument is really interesting. But the more precise it gets on a retail perspective, the greater the value. So that's why I was very curious to hear around, Eva, how you're trying to measure the positive effect of each and every three, because I think that's what we're all looking to. We're all very concerned around the climate crisis, as you said, Nina. And how do we act to contribute to lessen the impact, to mitigate the crisis? And how do we measure that? Can we measure it one for one out of a retail perspective compared to a national governmental perspective, or on a corporate level? How should we do this? And that is exactly what we try to solve at Doconomy, provide language around impact that can travel in between users, in between countries, and make impact understood so that we know how to reduce it as well.
That is so great to hear. And I think you make a very good point. It's not anyone in isolation. It's not just the end customer in isolation. It's not just one particular government in isolation. It's everyone together. But you provided me with a lovely segue to ask Iwa exactly that question, which is, at Smart Forest, how are you actually measuring the impact? Because I think, there are a lot of incentives now in play. I recently had a fascinating discussion with an estate owner in the Midlands of England. And he was saying, not every tree is created equal. Spruce, for example, is very different than oak, and trying to explain, that you would need acres of land, especially with certain government incentives. I know now that the UK government is trying to come up with more tax incentives for climate-friendly changes that can be made. So I'm very curious, if we're just talking about trees for now, let's all be tree huggers for this episode. I certainly am. Iwa, how are you thinking about that at Smart Forest?
Yes, sure. Obviously, there is a great differentiation between different types of the trees and how much of the emission they consume. That obviously depends on the type of the tree, on the size of the tree, and where the tree is being planted. Because you have different things which are influencing. So, for example, the small tree from one side is consuming less carbon because it's small. On the other hand, the tree is consuming the higher number of carbon when it's growing. So you have to keep in mind those two facts. Also, different trees might have different, as I already said, different offset levels. So, for example, the oak could have, it depends on the size. So it could be from 1 kilo to 20 kilo per year. For example, with fast growing trees, you have a higher number at some point. because obviously they are growing bigger and rapidly. They need to use much more of the CO2 to build the fiber, so build the normal mass of the tree. And that also depends on the moisture level of the tree. So obviously, if you're measuring just the carbon, you're measuring the size of the tree, so how much it grows during the year. And obviously, you make the assumption because you cannot know fully, for example, how high percent of the roots the tree will have. Let's say it's 1/3 of the mass. The same is for the branches, leaves, and so on. And basically, knowing how dense is the tree, how high is the moisture level, what's the average size during that year on the plantation, we could make the assumption that, for example, during the period where there are the leaves, so let's say the spring to summer, we can say that it neutralized this and this amount. But also you have to keep in mind that in the plantation, despite the trees, you have also the ground, which is also storing the carbon. So indeed, this is a pretty complex question.
No, but it's very insightful to know these things because, I'm not, I'm from the state of California, but we have all our wildfires and everyone assumes that we know everything about trees and wildfires and forest fires. And we're all, forestry experts, but unfortunately we are not. And so it's always good, I think, to understand that. I wonder, from your perspective at Smart Forest, you are getting people to actually invest in a plantation of trees or an individual tokenized tree, right? So I wonder how that differs perhaps from what Mathias and his team are building at Doconomy, where it's much more lifestyle focused and reducing harm, if you will, harm reduction in the context of climate change. Whereas for you, you're providing the actual I suppose, carbon capture solution on the other end. How do you think about getting that messaging across to the end consumer who you want to invest?
Mm-hmm. I think we are able with Mathias to share the market easily. Because obviously the question is, as Mathias already mentioned, is not only to neutralize, but also somehow to measure and to know and to be conscious. This is very important. And by the way, Nina, you started from the beginning that many people would be happy to, and obviously their customer decisions are showing that they are preferring green products. They are willing to go green. About 75%, according to statistics, people, especially 25 to 35, are keen to pay more for the product if the product is green. So, for example, it's carbon neutral and so on. Also, coming back to the other part of your question, it's impossible to fully reduce the emission, even if we talk, for example, about the green energy like solar panels or windmills. They are obviously being produced somewhere, so we have the carbon which is being released when you produce. I guess Mathias would be the best person to give some exact numbers, for example, how much of the carbon it would produce release in this case. Obviously, if we talk about the trees, also at the moment where you cut them, you have two options. Either you burn it, and then obviously there is the carbon dioxide going back to the atmosphere, or you build a house. And if the house is going to stay for 100 years, then obviously the carbon will be stored for that period. There is a lot of people who are asking this question, and the market, it's very complex itself. It's like 65, I guess, different trading schemes currently for the carbon emissions. So I'm afraid it would take like 5 hours to explain that in details.
Fair enough. Well, on that note, we're going to go to a quick break, but stick with us, listeners. We have more on carbon credits when we're back.
Let's talk about the future of payments. Your Breaking Payments exclusive series is here, and we are ready to showcase how fintech has deconstructed the payments industry and is rebuilding it seamlessly as an embedded experience for the client. Stay tuned for new episodes every month on Breaking Banks Europe.
And we're back. We've been talking about carbon credits, green credits, often more commonly known in the context of carbon offsetting. And this is something that we've talked about a lot, and actually in other episodes of Breaking Banks Europe. But there's something that Mathias said in the first part of our conversation that I wanted to come back to. And this is the idea of incentive alignment. And I think that there's an interesting dilemma that poses itself when we say, hey, offset your carbon for your purchase by adding on, £2 or something, or in the case of a flight, increase the cost of your flight and offset it and we'll plant a tree or whatever. And so this kind of traps many consumers into this idea that we can solve the problem by just paying a little bit more. And Iwa, you also mentioned that, Gen Z, younger millennials are open and not just open, but willing to pay more, which is great for this particular purpose. But I wonder, if we think about incentive alignment, how should we be thinking about the wider change that we want to see? You touched on it earlier, Mathias, about looking at the overall impact that our lives have, but can you kind of walk us through how you think about that alignment as a consumer, and then perhaps also as wider retailers and governments?
Yeah, thank you. So, to Eva's point, this is a growing and increasing complexity around the structures, which is one of the challenges. So, in regard of understanding your impact in order to reduce it, I think we need to activate a lot of unorthodox alliances, companies that might not have worked together before, organizations that might not have worked together before. When we started working, we got MasterCard and the United Nations to unite in one of our services and to bring this to the world. And that was a brilliant partnership with Doconomy and them, but it was the first one in that space. And so this is going to take some new thinking to get our head around and to educate the users around their impact in order for them to understand their impact. And coming back to incentives and, not just paying up for a get out of jail for free card, it's like you get on our flight and you don't even have to pay any carbon offsetting. It's included in our loyalty program or in your ticket or in your luggage tag or whatever. I think that's the wrong way to go. I think we need to understand our impact. If we don't understand it, how can we then do something about it? And the way we're looking at it out of the carbon offsetting perspective, the economy is not making any money on carbon offsetting. It's not the business we're in, and we don't want to take money from that market to the benefit of us. That money should go to that market. But we do provide opportunity or offset, if you'd like to, working together with the UNFCCC for a long time and developed a strategy around that we call something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue.
Oh, lovely.
So that's basically incentivizing in different ways. So once you understand your impact, and if you would like to offset for it, you could choose to go old school, and trees are a brilliant place to go to look for carbon offsetting, and working with MasterCard and the Priceless Planet Coalition is one, and they have a very ambitious target for planting trees across the world that is connecting with every cardholder and member of the Priceless Planet Coalition. And you can do the Klarna route, going down what would then potentially be something new, working with carbon offsetting out of a donations perspective into environmental projects that might not have a direct offsetting component, but is working to the benefit of the environment together with their partners at Milky Wire. Or you could go for something borrowed, which would then be lending money to support initiatives, getting sustainable production practices in place. Or you could go for something new, which would then be direct air carbon capturing or other new innovation and technologies that's coming into play. And the reason why I'm going through these four is because they have resonate differently with different target groups and different people. Some are looking to the fourth one being blue, which is blue carbon. And personally, I love the ocean, and there's nothing that I appreciate more. out of an environmental perspective. So for me, blue and mangrove or seabeds are extremely interesting to donate to in regard to carbon offsetting. So the most important component is that there is a quote that Jean-Paul Sartre said once, that once you know and are aware, you can choose to do something or you can choose to do nothing, but you're still aware. And I think if we can work together to build this awareness, the tools and the solutions will come, because the awareness will create a demand. And where there is a demand, there will be money, because where there will be money, there will be profits. And if we can make saving the planet a profitable effort, then the planet will be saved in no time.
Absolutely. Oh, Mathias, you're a man after my own heart, quoting Jean-Paul Sartre. Lovely, lovely.
Hey, see you in Paris. I told you, that's the place to be, right?
It's the place to be. Off the back of that, I find that very, very interesting, because I had not realized that the ocean was such a big tool as well in helping us combat climate change and in aiding carbon capture. I think one of the things I wanted to kind of zoom in on, though, is Iwa, your earlier comment where you were telling us about different trees and all these different aspects that go into play, especially when we talk about, in particular, forests and carbon capture. And this boils down to the question of legitimacy and credibility. And the reason I also bring it up in the context of smart forest is because you have an interesting proposition that is also dips its toe in Web3, where we know that there has been quite a bit of speculation. NFTs are very popular at the moment. I think what you're building in terms of your NFTs is something that has value. I was about to say has actual value, but heaven forbid someone with a Bored Ape comes after me on Twitter. But I wonder, you're mixing these two worlds where, on the one hand, carbon capture is relatively new. I won't say new because people have been researching for many, many years. But as you say, there's so many different factors. And as Mathias earlier stated, there's no one defined kind of standard quite yet as to what it means. And I imagine that even when there is, it will be regional differences as well, around the world, geographical. So I wonder how you think about building credibility for your business, for what you're trying to build for the world here. Because on the one hand, the actual thing that you're doing, measuring the carbon offset of your trees, and then the NFT part, the Web3 part, both are a bit blurred, kind of gray areas. So how do you think about legitimacy and credibility at Smart Forest?
It's obviously a very important question. I guess a lot of companies are struggling with it. We basically have pretty easy model because we indeed have a plantation, and each tree, each NFT has the exact GPS coordinates. So if someone wants, they could go to the plantation and have a look, or even hug the tree, as you said.
Excellent.
So in our case, it's pretty easy, but indeed there is something which is called greenwashing, which is existing, and it's when the company is paying to officially offset their emission. Greenwashing happens when there is no real action standing behind it. There is just a lot of green marketing involved in that. And by the way, we were mentioning about the carbon credits and so on, but we didn't mention the core. Maybe not all of the listeners, they know, because there are different carbon markets, overall different ones, and one which Mathias more or less described as the complementary. So where the different countries, they have different limits. And there is also voluntary offsetting. And for example, in case of a forest and in case of the trees, most of the projects are working in the voluntary. Voluntary means that any of us could, according to the wish, offset the emission. And again, there is the question how to measure that. So, for example, using different fuel on cooking stoves in India, let's say, how much it would influence indeed the carbon neutralization. It's very difficult to say some exact numbers. Sometimes they are taken out of the blue, but obviously a lot of different scientists are working on that. But as I mentioned, with the trees, it's pretty easy because you just measure the trees. It's pretty easy in this case. By the way, I've been on the Dubai Expo recently, World Expo, and Spain was promoting themselves as the country who is offsetting through the algae. So indeed, through the ocean.
Oh, brilliant.
So they have this program, and they had the whole level, bottom level of the exposition just with algae and how much of CO2 they could neutralize.
That is super, super exciting. I think that is probably one we'll have to have another episode on, because I'm now fascinated in this blue credit or blue carbon situation. And Mathias, I think, you've got to have a word with the Swedish government, because I would have expected more. Sweden, it definitely has a lot of surface area touching the sea.
Oh yeah, no, but it's interesting because your reaction is pretty normal, I would say. I mean, oceans are considered to be the main natural carbon sink. They I think they and keep me honest here, Eva, but I think that they are capable of absorbing around 50% of the carbon emitted into the atmosphere. So they're doing some heavy lifting, being the oceans, in helping us to get this crisis resolved. That's for sure.
Brilliant. The one last thing that I want to touch on before we wrap up is kind of a surprise question. So listeners, this is not one that I prepped anybody for, but one that I think, we are coming from the perspective of Europe, Breaking Banks Europe. And we know that climate change is disproportionately affecting people and communities in the global south. And so I think about this often because I do a lot of work with refugees, and nowadays a lot of refugees are coming to Europe because their homes are no longer habitable. There's a intense drought, which leads to famine, which means that people need to leave. Or, in the case of just quite recently with Tonga, you've got entire islands that are completely submerged. And of course, that was not necessarily climate change related because it was an underwater volcano, but we see this happening where there are actual islands disappearing. So I wonder, for both of you, sitting as you do kind of in the Western world, how do you think about creating an equitable change? And does carbon credit actually play a role in that at all? And how do you think about this as we move forward to combat climate change? Iwa, do you want to start? Oh, sorry, Mathias, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Sorry, Iwa, you can go ahead. It's just a topic very close at heart, but please go.
Yes, but basically, Mathias, if you want, you can have a word first. Feel free.
Okay, super. Thank you. I think this is one of the most important questions around the climate crisis and how we distribute the opportunity to act on it. All of Africa, on an industrial perspective, emits 4% of the global carbon footprint. 4%. Might be even less. It might be 3 point something. So we really address this as a problem created by all, because it's not created by all. It's created by, the top 10, 15% emitters in the world. And looking at Sweden, we have an average of 12 metric tons as carbon footprint per capita. Looking at Colombia, it's down to 2. So, I mean, if we are to cut our emissions in half, that's going to have a tremendous impact compared to Colombia. And I'm not even looking at the average per capita carbon footprint of the whole African continent, and would probably be somewhere below 1 metric ton per capita. So this is where, for years now, people have been talking about financial inclusion, the unbanked, and getting access to credit and getting access to credible and safe transfers. I think we need to start talking about climate instead, climate inclusion. And that, in order to do so, the language around climate impact needs to be set. It needs to be distributed in a way so that everyone can connect to it. It needs to be understood by everyone, and it can't discriminate anyone. That's why I'm also proud of Doconomy having developed the lifestyle carbon footprint calculator together with the UNFCCC, as they are setting many standards and they are working according to to best in class kind of performance. So I think that is one way to contribute to that. Another way to contribute is coming back to Eva's example around the cooking stoves and all of the more older components in carbon offsetting, and how to contribute to that in the best way. Now we see a tremendous uptick in donations, because that's basically what carbon offsetting is all about, giving your money away for someone else to do something with it, And now it's inspiring to see also that investments are coming into play, making use of the same mechanics, also having a financial return or a return in other value. So I think that is where we need to be in order to get this sorted. We need to work everyone, all hands on deck to get this done. But we must also be aware that this is an unjust and unevenly distributed impact. I think that what India did at COP26 was a very good indicator on the fact that we can't just move on in the ignorance of things, thinking that we know how to solve this best, and we've been doing this for years, and we've created the largest footprint. But of course, there is development in the world that will need energy, that will need products, that will need ambition to create a better tomorrow for me and my children. And we need to address that and not just, ignore or discriminate away from it. So I think it's a brilliant question, and it's actually another episode, I think, because it's so much to talk about.
Absolutely. Iwa, any words on that?
Yes, sure. Basically, there's a very good example of China, which is currently one of the biggest emitters, but they are working together to resolve that questions. I know the main two Chinese banks, which were supporting through the green credits mechanism, changing into the factories who are the biggest emitters. And basically, as far as I remember, they had two different ways to resolve the question. First one was to cut the financing of the companies who are not fulfilling the SDG goals. I guess it was mainly the companies who were having heavy production. And the other way was to support the green innovation in the industry itself. And basically, I guess the connection of those two attitudes. So like in the carbon trading, you have cap and trade, where you have some limits, and the company has to, in this case, the country has to fulfill, or on the regional level, the company has to fulfill those limits. And if not, either they will have to pay the money for the additional offsetting, or they will have some sanctions. And the other way is to support financially some of the transitions, innovation, green transitions, let's call it like that. So to avoid the bad impact on the ecology. And I would say that we can see some of the countries being in the example. China obviously has still a long road to go, but at least they started to work on their ecology, and I guess it's really brilliant. I'm currently in India, and I really love to hear such a changes also, obviously.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. And I think, as Mathias rightly stated, we've got a lot more to talk about, and it could be a whole other episode. But for now, we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much to my two brilliant guests for speaking with us today, for educating me on the topic. Mathias, where can our listeners find out more about you and about Doconomy?
You could check out doconomy.com or swing by our office in Stockholm for a cup of tea.
Oh, well, I'm going to take you up on that because I do miss fika.
You're welcome.
So I'll definitely swing by at some point. And Iwa, where can our listeners find out more about you or Smart Forest?
Also on our webpage, it's smartforest.world.
Brilliant. Well, thank you again so much for joining me. Remember, we are all in this together, so we will take that with us into our everyday lives. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode of Breaking Banks Europe.
Thanks for listening to Breaking Banks Europe, a Provoke Media podcast in cooperation with FinTech Stage. Don't forget to tweet us out, shout out, or post to the team at Breaking Banks EU on Twitter. If there's something or someone you'd like to hear on our cast, let us know. See you next week on Breaking Banks Europe.